right now is one bit.
Hello, I'm back, but not as a presenter or nor a moderator. All right, our next speaker is Dr. Rose Clesham, and her topic is Artificial Intelligence Changing the Face of Formative and Summative Assessment. Now let me introduce Dr. Rose. Dr. Rose Clesham is the Director of Academic Standards and Measurement at Pearson. She holds a master's degree in Formative and Summative Assessment from Cambridge University and a doctorate in Educational Assessment. Her research interests include the development of assessment and artificial intelligence and ongoing international educational strategies and policies. So, ladies and gentlemen, we welcome Dr. Rose Clesham.
Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We've made it to nearly the end of the first day. You just have to put up for the next 40 minutes, and then we're okay for a nice evening. Right, I'm going to talk to you about. We might think it's thinking sometime in the future. Actually, almost everything I will talk to you about is actually things that are happening now, which it's always interesting to reflect this. My background, before we start, I was a teacher for many years. My background actually isn't in languages. My background is in maths and science. And I was a teacher for a long time, and then I got very interested in assessment, so I went off and did a master's, and I did a doctorate in assessment. I've worked in every area of educational assessment now, every area, because vocational, academic, computer-based, paper-based, criterion-based, standards-based, and now I've moved into this area the last few years. And I'm fascinated. I've done quite a lot of work in e-assessment over the years. I've worked for PISA a lot, which uses a sort of very IRT model. And I'm fascinated to not just work in this where we are now, but actually where this will go in the next 5 to 10 years. This is not a static environment. If any of you went to the workshop that I ran beforehand, some of the slides are the same, most of them are not. I went into, in the workshop, I talked more about, I suppose, notions of AI and where AI came from and issues to do with assessments. This is more, it covers the same ground, but in particular I want to just respond to those questions really about the use of AI in formative and summative assessment. So why AI now? And the simple answer is that there are three elements really to why there has been such an explosion of this area, not just in education but in lots of different areas. One is an obvious one, the explosion of data in our everyday worlds. We know this in every aspect of our data. We need more data, we want more data is expected of us. It's a very data-filled environment. We also know that computers are getting exponentially sort of more powerful. We know Moore's law that says, it used to say that every 18 months you double your capacity for at least the cost, if not cheaper. That probably is not the case now. It's probably even faster than that now. And we also have significant algorithmic developments in terms of what you can do with data. So those three things really have worked as separate entities until about 10 years ago, and then all those three things started to converge. And actually, the assessment that I'm going to use as a case study for some of this actually started 10 years ago, funnily enough. It was, I don't know whether that was exactly by design, but it's quite interesting, because I wasn't working in this area then, that actually it was at that point three elements. And actually, outside of the area I'm going to talk to you about, quite often when you hear about AI, you hear about it in a gaming way, and it's actually almost like a proof of concept in terms of being able to match, if not better, quite sophisticated human judgment, which is interesting. And this has developed over the last 10 years, and as you know, I talked about it a bit more in the last session. I showed a scary video. And in economic forecasting and in things like agriculture, all those things are using huge sets of data to predict how best to manage particular certain situations. So my question, which you already know the answer to, is, well, where is educational assessment in this AI area? And actually, I would say, because I know I may look incredibly young, but I'm not. And education has often really lagged behind technology and technological developments, I would say. And actually, you'd sort of think, well, it would be not particularly sort of proactive in terms of the use of AI in educational assessment, but it is here. And actually, my case in point is quite interesting, because I'm an assessment person, really, rather than a language person. And so I go to loads of assessment conferences. And now I go to lots of language conferences as well. And you almost never hear AI mentioned in assessment conferences. It's sort of as if it doesn't exist. But it does exist. And it's quite fascinating that the place that it emerged is in this area of language testing. And as I mentioned earlier, if I had to pick an area to develop AI, I would have said, don't choose this one, because it's really quite hard to do it. And actually, that's exactly why it emerged. It didn't emerge because it was an interesting research project. It emerged because I think there was a need for it. If you're going to have notions of and it doesn't have to be global, it could be national, it could be local actually, but if you really want to think about what's required to have a very well understood construct and a very well understood system of assessment, and if you think about that in terms of languages, then these four elements here are quite important. The first thing is, what you've got to make sure is that you are construct representative. I've worked in assessment, as I said, for a long time, and what often happens with national and international assessments is the bits that are hard to do get thrown away. Okay? In England, for example, English language, the speaking element of English language used to be part of the construct. It used to be part of the national assessment. The reliability of it was really, really low. Teachers weren't very good at standardising their judgments. And so what happened in England is, rather than try and solve the problem, they got rid of speaking. They got rid of that element of the construct. It happens a lot in areas where, in the end, assessments become self-defining, that you turn a construct into things that can be assessed quite easily. In this area, what's been quite one of the reasons I was interested in this area was that the whole point of it is that if you couldn't do all four communication skills, you can't do any of them. So if you're going to do this thing, if you're going to try and use AI in this environment, you have got to be representative across all four skills. And of course, in particular, the productive skills of speaking and writing, those are the challenges. Because those are the things that, if I asked a question here now and asked everybody in this room to respond in terms of a written response or in terms of a spoken response, all of you would say something different. So how do we cope with that? So we need to be representative. We need it to be fair. If somebody takes it in, it's somebody in London, somebody in New York, somebody in sort of Kuching, are we happy that they will end up with the same treatment? Do we want it to be reliable, which is, I'm afraid, an assessment word, but almost the most important assessment word. But we know what the most important assessment word is, don't we? That it's valid, that it is a reasonable thing to do, and not just something that you can do. And we want it, for students want these assessments to be fast and efficient. If it's used in the classroom, teachers and students want this thing. It's not going to take 6 weeks to get your data back. They want it back now. And so to do these things, that convergence of the lines I showed you, computers are solving those problems. We are able to use AI in this environment. And we have I would say, I'm not a language person, I'm an assessment person, and what I say, you may disagree, but I think there is a fairly recognised construct in terms of language proficiency. They may vary a little bit depending on what framework you use, but I would say, compared to many other areas, there is a fairly good level of agreement. And of course, these measurement systems now can do things that more traditional methods can't do. Okay, assessment. I'm not going to, as they say, teach my grandmother to suck eggs. We all know this. Assessment is a good thing. It's good for teachers and it's good for students. Both of those people are aided by good assessment. And we know that we can have formative assessment, which is more to do with really building a relationship or a dialogue between the teacher and the students to think about where their strengths and weaknesses are and where they go next on an individual level, and then obviously on a class level. It helps teachers in terms of informing what they do, and in terms of, again, individuals and students. And I'm afraid my main area in assessment for a long time has been this really dark side, the summative side. I did my master's in formative and summative assessment at Cambridge University, and at that time, Inside the Black Box was going on, like early 1998 to about 2002, Paul Black, and there was these big figures, and it was fantastic. And then as soon as I did it, I went to the dark side. I didn't start working in the formative assessment side. I went to work in the summative assessment side, and they were not very happy with me at all. But it has a place. It has a really important place. Assessment of learning. We might say that formative is assessment for learning, but summative assessment usually takes place after a learning period and is a point in the sand. It is a point of saying this is where you are. And it's used, as we know, for certification. It has currency, and it's used in all sorts of different sort of environments. But if you use computers and if you use AI, then we are talking about this transformation of an educational assessment model from having sort of that horrible picture on the left that we're all probably familiar with in one way or another, of hundreds of students sitting exams at the same time of the day in the same date and the same, in a very, very regimented form. That can radically disappear in terms of being used on an individual level for formative purposes, and also in secure, either high or low stakes environments for summative purposes. It flips the model completely. And again, if you're using computer assessment, if we're thinking about language skills, then you can assess lots of things at the same time. And particularly with language skills, what most people would say is that you hardly ever use one of those communication skills in isolation. So the use of computer-aided assessment allows integrated tasks. They allow you to, use sort of reading into writing, reading and speaking. They allow you to use very authentic contexts. and so it becomes less of an artificial artefact. And that really talks to me, as an assessment person, about the notion of about it being valid. It isn't just something that you like mechanically put together because you can. You actually start from the premise of how should we be assessing language proficiency skills. And so if you're going to have a computer test, which I'm going to talk to you about in this case, there are a lot of them are variations on a theme, whether they're formative or summative. There are differences between them, which I'll talk about. But you are talking about the idea that you've got a computer, the use of complete use of a computer. You've got automated scoring, which means that actually for the receptive skills, these things are fairly closed responses. They're sort of right, wrong, variations on that theme. But for the productive skills, we're using AI on so that we are marking to the same standard responses that every single one of them is different. We're talking about the 4 skills, and we're talking about lots and lots of different item types. Some of them are single skills and some of them are integrated. If you're going to do this, and this is something that I'm going to say, but actually then say that things are changing, this involves an enormous infrastructure. So when this test was set up 10 years ago, the amount of trialing and pre-testing was enormous. If you're going to make a claim that you have a global, let's say you have a global test, then you've got to make sure that that is representative globally, that you have to get responses from people from a wider representative group as you can. You cannot have that claim and then say, well, actually, because we're based in London, we'll actually only do, let's say, European test takers. That's not going to wash. So when this was set up, millions of responses had to be collected globally, okay, and train the systems. That is going to change, though, and I think I was talking to somebody earlier about sort of saying that as we move forward, that enormously heavy lifting that goes on behind the scene in terms of calibration and training, I think over the next 5 to 10 years that is going to be much reduced. So it will be in everybody's back pockets, the ability to be able to develop these type of assessments. In terms of the speaking assessments, they are used in lots of different places already. This isn't science fiction, this is fact. And actually one of the interesting areas that it's used is actually in aviation, where there is an international call language, so that every airport around the world uses English. And they use, for their air traffic controllers, they use an automated speaking assessment to assess the proficiency of people that become air traffic controllers. And you can imagine this is a pretty high-risk environment. So it does a pretty good job. And I'm sorry for boring the people that were in my session earlier, but in fact, what's interesting I find about that particular issue is that the people sometimes that are not so good at aviation training for these international call language in English are native English speakers, because they don't think they have to try. They don't actually put as much effort in as people who are not native speakers, who actually go through the motion of learning properly and applying themselves properly. So people sometimes think that if you're a native speaker or in any language, then it means that any assessment in that language goes without saying. That is not true. And so people that say, well, I'm a native speaker and I didn't get a perfect score, well, if you didn't actually concentrate properly and if you didn't actually answer what you should have been answering, you won't get a perfect score. This item, is just sort of indicating that with these sort of systems, you can do some interesting things. So you can assess lots of different traits using lots of different item types all at the same time. And these are the very things that humans find extremely laborious to do over and over again. So in this case, there are 5 item types. The breadth of the box means it has more weighting because it's more of a task. If you have to retell a lecture, if you hear a lecture and then you have to retell what that lecture basically said, That's quite difficult to do compared to, for example, if you are given a sentence and you have to repeat the sentence. So you can mix and match different types of features that you want to assess and give them appropriate weighting. And don't underestimate this thing about being able to assess multiple traits at the same time. And there are a large number of traits. In this particular test, these are the 4 traits that are assessed. But different assessments use different traits. Okay, so some of them require an immediate response, some of them require you to have a think about and then give us a more considered response. And the way that they are effectively trained is that every single item at the moment, this is again a work in progress, every single item in these sort of assessments have to be trialled and developed first. When people take this particular test, when people take the test, there are a proportion of questions that in fact are trial items, and they don't know which are the trial items. And then you don't get this thing called a pre-test effect, where I in my past, I used to be involved in national testing in the UK, and we used to have to trial items in friendly schools. And we had to sort of lock the doors, and there'd be like maybe 100 students in the hall, and they were trialling items for us. And we'd say, listen, you know, this is very, very important. Okay, you must not tell anybody what you're doing. And what we want you to do is we want you to try really, really hard. And some hand would go up in the back without fail every single time and say, excuse me, does this count? Does this assessment count? And you'd say, well, no, but we want you to still try really, really hard. And then, guess what? Some people didn't try really, really hard. And so you never really knew how well the items performed, because you weren't really sure whether people were trying or not. Often in these assessments, they're embedded into the live test, so people don't know which are the live items and which are the trial items. They're trialled. They're transcribed by almost like coders who transcribe what they hear into not just written prose, but all the extreme features that I am speaking with now, where I've stopped, where I've hesitated, my mannerisms, everything. And then that goes into then a machine, the machine that we use, with a mark. Okay, so it's loaded with lots of information about the actual response and the mark that it got, which is obtained by expert human markers. Okay, 1, 2, 3 of them. We hope at that point it's had maybe 1,000 responses. We hope that it's now got it. But we have to then find out whether it has got it by then giving it another 1,000 and seeing whether the marks it comes out with are the same as the human marks. That's the key to the quality. If they're different, the human wins, not the machine. If they don't agree, the item goes no further. So the whole point is with these is they have to be very highly correlated. And you get all sorts of, you get sort of waveform information, we get spectral analysis. There's all this sort of technical stuff, and you can measure lots of things. But in the end, as a test taker and as a marker, let's see whether this. No, it hasn't. There were some audio graphics on this with some examples of this female here who was actually very good. I don't think she was a native speaker, but she was very good. And they were both saying the same sentence. They were both saying New York City is famous for its ethnic diversity. And you can see their scores at the bottom, okay? And this was another person who said the same sentence, and his scores were not massively less, but they were less. And then if you look at if you want to look at that sort of stuff, you will see the reasons for that. They are there, they are evidenced. But the machine has learnt by being trained on loads and loads of responses that it will allow for things that it's never heard before. And you can choose As I said, you can choose the traits that you want. I would say, and it's going to say the same for writing, that at the moment, speaking assessments and writing assessments do the more technical aspects of speaking and writing better than the more creative aspects of speaking and writing. But that will change. That will change. One of the, I think I'll show you now, this is an example of an item of speaking where they see an image that they've never seen before. They've given about half a minute to think about what it's saying, and then they have to talk about what's in that image. And the key to this is reliability. How reliable is the machine compared to the human? And the same sort of thing goes with writing. They used a lot. They used a lot for formative assessment. Again, this is an example of an item that is effectively a blank page. And they're using a computer. They're not handwritten. But then that response can then be fed into the machine. You can choose what sort of forms of writing you want to assess. And you can see there the sorts of things that they are able to assess right now. But the one at the left-hand side there, the spoken one, the bottom one says intelligibility. And that is becoming more of a thing. I think there'll be a few talks this few days about the new version of the CFER and this notion about what communicative language is, is focused on, or perhaps more emphasised with the new version of the CFER, which is less to do with the technical aspects and more to do with, do people actually understand each other? And we are now able to look at those traits. We use a system called latent semantic analysis. There are slightly different systems depending on the assessments, but this one, basically what it does is it sort of absorbs huge amounts of text from encyclopedias, from all sorts of sources, and it understands then how words relate to each other. It doesn't count the words in a sentence or the number of syllables or the power. It doesn't look at that surface feature level at all. It considers how the written piece makes sense, okay? How the words relate to each other. And I hate to say this, but then it turns it into an algorithm. That sounds terrible, but it's the way it works. So that then once it's been trained, it will compare a new piece of writing to these sort of 1,000 scripts that it's seen before in terms of its quality on those traits. And again, same sort of way, it's trained and then it's validated. Okay? It also knows when it doesn't know. So if somebody writes in a different language, if somebody doesn't actually answer the question, it throws it out and it goes to a human person to intervene. Reliability being a watchword here. There was a thing that went on Twitter, I'll whiz through this, I've only got a few minutes, but it just, my last, I think, port of call. There was a thing that went out, as I sort of went viral last year, or the last couple of years ago, where Ben's grandmother, when she used to use Google, she used to say please and thank you, right, when she'd ask a question, and he thought this was really funny. I asked my nan why she used please and thank you, and it seemed that she thought there was somebody, a physical person at Google headquarters answering her question. Okay, and it was felt like this was like an amusing thing to say. However, I would like to draw your attention to, this is a quote from Fei-Fei Li, who I'm not sure if he still is, but he was the chief scientist at Google. He's a Stanford professor, and he made a really, really big point of this, to say to people, don't be misled with the idea of artificial intelligence having nothing to do with humans. It's based on human judgment and the predicting of human judgment. But, this idea that it's somehow divorced from all of us, that is not true, and particularly it is not true in educational assessment. If you think about medical diagnostics, they use enormous amounts of data, pure empirical data on their medical diagnostic sort of AI. In this environment, it's to do with the notion of human expert educationalists. That's a very important distinction. Why should we use computers? Well, why wouldn't we? You know, they can do routine things better and faster and more reliably than we can. Why would we not want to use that technology to help us and to help teachers in their environment? I was a teacher for a long time. I would have quite liked to have had some of these tools. I said in my session earlier, I was in a generation of schooling where there were no scientific calculators, there were no computers actually either, and so we used slide rules and logbooks to work out trigonometry. Those times gone. In 10 years' time, people will be saying the same thing about this. Why are humans? What's the problem with humans? Well, there's no problem with humans, but human raters have a lot to contend with in terms of applying the same standard on a Monday, on a Friday, at a weekend. Don't give extreme scales. If you ask human raters to give a mark between 1 and 10, they'll never give a 1, they'll never give a 10, all that sort of stuff. Students like it. Students like computer-aided assessment. They say so in thousands. So, you know, sometimes people use the argument that somehow this is a false dawn and actually people don't like using computers. Actually, people under 30 do. So, you can, in this environment in language, it's a really, really big thing, in my view, that we can honestly say we can assess all aspects of communication. Okay? We can make sure that those items are valid and reliable, and that they, you know, we are reducing bias to a degree that human raters will never be able to do on their own. And in conclusion, I think there is this. It is just this thing about you can use these technologies for formative purposes, for summative purposes. You can design them as you wish. We need to modernise particularly high-stakes summative assessments in terms of making them more reliable and fast and efficient for all the users. This is not an all or nothing. This is not I'm not proposing argument, and I don't think anybody ever does, to say it's either all AI or it's no AI. It's about using available technology to support teachers so that teachers have more time in actually their communications and their relationships in a class, rather than being tied down and bogged down, you know, all the time. The two limiting factors in progression of certainly language, which takes a long, long time, is number one, students need to practice. And in using these sort of systems, you can do that inside a classroom, you can do that outside a classroom. Teachers need, therefore, potentially to assess. They cannot give the amount of time that on an individual level. But it's about using those things as blended environments, using them both in tandem. Okay, it is not a case of sort of saying, we have nothing to do with this anymore, over to you. It's about both, using the strengths of both. Anything that that is going to be moving into this area, the whole point of it's got to be researched, it's got to be evidenced, it's got to be robust. And those things have happened over the last 10 years, and they will happen an awful lot more over the next period of time. And so what I'm saying to you now, in 5 years' time, will be completely obsolete, but hopefully it'll be an awful lot better still than what we have now. If you think about sort of the involvement of paper-based testing that has had the same model for thousands of years, in this environment, things will change as the need arises. And I have really great hopes for where we are and where we will go in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rose Clesham. That was really very enlightening. And I think I'm going to create an AI to function only for one function, not to function in everything, because this is basically assessment and evaluation. This is interesting. The one thing that I pick up, this is a comment and remark, that if, let's say, I am the AI, for assessment and evaluation, then I will be the AI. But you look at a human being, you ask them to teach, you ask them to mark books, you ask them to do assessment. They do everything, and they go back, they have to clean the house. So you see, how can the human be compared to an AI? Fantastic, wonderful. Big round of applause for Dr. Rose Clesham. I think I like this very much. All right, we're going to open for questions. Any questions? Wow. One, two. All right, we take yours first. Just hold on. Yeah. Yeah. Name and where you come from. Oh, can I?
There's one here.
Can you give the mic then?
Oh, you've got one. There's one there. Managed to turn it on.
Thank you, Rose. Okay, your talk is very inspiring and forward-looking, and I'm also an assessment person. I think, could you give audience a general suggestion that, okay, apart from learning how to teach, now probably they are learning how to assess student language, then, what general suggestion you give teachers that, now they go one step further, how to embrace the digital literacy in language assessment?
Yeah, I think, and this happens already. The key to all this is that, as we all know, people that have done sort of, who are involved in either teaching or have done courses in formative assessments and all this, the magic phrase is mind the gap. Okay, you can assess all you want, right? You can keep testing people, you can keep assessing people, but how do you improve? How do you make improvements? And the key to, let's say, many formative assessments, some of the formative assessments that are used in using these technologies now, 8-year-olds take them on an iPad. It's not a threatening environment. It's colourful. It's stimulating and all the rest of it. But the items have to be linked to something. They're not random objects. So if you have a framework, whether it's things connected to this CFAR, whatever it is, the Chinese scale of English, I've done some work on that of late, and there are, I think there are 2,500 statements. Something like this. They have a meaning. So if you create assessments that are linked to very particular either learning goals or learning objectives, then you have a start. Then to say, okay, these are your strengths, these are your weaknesses. These are areas where you're not getting up to. This is which then links to courseware and links to, there is a whole ecosystem here, which then needs to be supporting an assessment. An assessment on its own is not going to tell you. It might tell you where the problem is. It's not going to fix it for you. There has to be an infrastructure then of a supporting environment, whether it's on a local level, a national level, or an international level.
Okay. The second question, yeah, gentleman at the back. Your name and where you come from.
Hi, I'm John, and I'm from Kuala Lumpur.
You don't sound like you do.
I do look like it, though. Your presentation makes it quite clear that computers can do lots of things that English language teachers have been doing for years. And that's why one of the results of AI, not just in language teaching, but in every industry, one of the resulting fears is job displacement. Yeah. So with that in mind, what is your assessment of the future job market for English language teachers?
That's a very loaded question. My view, to be perfectly honest with you, my view, it's about it has to be on a professional level, really. My view is that the primary objective of educators is to provide the most high quality education that our learners deserve, right? And that I go back to my thesis, and it won't change. If I'd had these technologies available to me, my teaching would have been better. It would be better. I do not believe the idea that the use of these technologies will remove teachers. If you ask me, well, will it remove me getting £400 a year doing some marking work? maybe that will reduce in time, but that will find a space somewhere else. I believe that you have to be honest here and ask what is the objective, and the objective is to have a very construct representative environment, allow students practice, allow teachers not to have to bear the burden of having to mark, and for it to be as valid and reliable as it should be. It's an honest answer, I hope.
Thank you. All right. I have a question. Now, AI in assessment and evaluation, we're looking at the level of reliability and validity. And we pit it against a teacher. The level of, the objectivity level in terms of result would be?
It depends what teacher. That's the problem.
Depends on what teacher.
Yeah, that's the problem. I've worked in national assessment systems for many years. So you have a national assessment system, and I know you have the same in Malaysia. And you have, it's basically sort of a pyramid system. You have the person at the top who maybe wrote the paper. They've got a small team around them. They know everything about that paper. And then what they do is that then they have to cascade their level of understanding down. And this happens in all the systems that run the same sort of system. At the bottom rung, there might be, in certain subjects, there might be 1,000 people marking at the bottom. What's their reliability compared to the originator? And I can tell you, you can read the literature yourself, if you're talking about productive type of skills, the reliability is not very good. Now, that's just a fact. Any sort of essay, an English essay, for example, you will never get reliability more than maybe 0.75, maybe. Speaking, probably maybe even a bit lower than that. And it's not to say that that's such a terrible thing. That's just working in that environment. You do the best you can. But these systems can largely eliminate that.
Thank you. So, a rhetorical question. To be or not to be AI? Ponder it, sleep on it, come back tomorrow. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah.